Hi, beauties. Welcome back. I am your host, Bridgett Brown, and this is Beyond Beauty Project, the podcast. Today, I am here with Judd Shaw. Judd is an award-winning author, serial entrepreneur, podcast host, lawyer, CEO, and father of 6. As president of Judd Shaw Injury Law, he has led one of New Jersey's most successful firms for 2 decades, proving that lawyers can deeply care about human connection. After reaching the pinnacle of professional success, Judd realized true fulfillment comes from the relationships that we build. This inspired him to develop the CURE frameworks, guides for fostering authenticity, vulnerability, and leadership in both life and in business. His motto, bravery starts in the heart, reflects his mission to help leaders create emotionally resilient workplaces and drive meaningful change. Judd is also a friend. He's a fellow speaker. He is a big cheerleader of what we do here at the Beyond Beauty Project. He has put our team here at BBP through some of his frameworks that he facilitates with teams globally. It was incredible. We laughed, we cried, we were inspired, and we grew. We have had amazing conversations on his podcast, Behind the Armor. And now I am honored and excited to share my friend with all of you guys today. Thank you so much, Judd, for being here.
Thanks for having me, Bridgett. Always a pleasure.
I feel like our stories, our journeys are very similar, although, completely different stories. But I think we're going to dive into success a lot today, perfectionism, some shame around all of that. You hit the pinnacle of success, yet you felt completely unfulfilled and disconnected from yourself. What do you think you thought success was supposed to look like?
What a great question. Thanks so much, Bridgett. I grew up with a father who was a famous boxing promoter. And so he was around a lot of masculinity, and a lot of that became toxic in that environment. And so his success is what I was trying to mirror. He had gold Rolexes and Ferraris and fancy things, and he was very showy. And I thought that all of that validation meant success. And once you get it, you find happiness. And so I worked really hard to climb Mount Success, only to find out when you get to that pinnacle, it can be extremely lonely if you're going there for the wrong reasons. And those were for all the reasons on the outside, those things that I thought would bring me happiness, only to find out that actually at my most successful, I was actually at my most unhappiest.
So you really thought that success looked like external things, external appearance.
Yeah, sure. And that's what I think is such a danger that's happening, particularly at least with young men. You have the Mr. Beasts of the world, which are great people. I mean, he's developed an incredible YouTube following. But what happens is a lot of us look at that and we use that as our guidepost for happiness. That if I can get that, then I will be. And chasing that is a lost cause.
So you spent years chasing this external validation. I would think, without knowing you then, that your life looked perfect from the outside. Was there a moment when you realized it was never going to be enough? Like, what was really happening behind the scenes? Pull the curtains back for us for a second.
It was that every time I would put on this fancy Italian pinstripe suit and the perfect tie and the perfectly pressed shirt and the perfectly tailored pants, that veneer that I would show up with at work, in the courtroom, with clients, that veneer is what so many people were applauding, that so many people were congratulating for. And so what they were doing was that the more success, the more billboards I was on, the more people that would recognize me, well, that must mean I'm more lovable, I'm more important. And the walls start caving in on that, because people are actually celebrating your inauthenticity. And so they're rooting for they're rooting for this version of me that's not me. And so then you have to keep that up. And that's because that's when it enters that wheel. Because now I need to keep up this veneer that people are celebrating because now that's the brand, that's the version they see and think of me. And actually, it's the complete opposite. But I couldn't figure out how to shed those masks without worrying about shedding clients or losing people who admired me for really the wrong reasons.
Wow. You said something so powerful in there. I was like, whoa. You said they were celebrating me for my inauthenticity. That's crazy how often that probably happens. Like people like you for the way you look or the clothes you have or the house you have.
Yeah. And then I think a lot of us box ourselves into that image or that identity, and we can't break free from it because I think, at least for me, I feared what was on the other side of that. And so I knew that if people were celebrating my success, which actually in turn was really making me lonely, I got lonelier.
Was there a moment that stood out to you or that you can tell us about that you really realized this success, these things, this external veneer is never going to make me feel good enough?
Yes. There was a moment where I was on a plane flying, and it occurred to me that I wasn't living the life that I wanted to live. I wasn't living the best version of myself. I wasn't living and showing up the way I wanted to. And instead of taking ownership and agency over what I can intentionally do about that, I fell back into old habits, into coping mechanisms. And I realized that, the minute I landed, I just wanted to go and numb this feeling, that I thought about the fact that I had done everything everybody told me to do. I reached the success that my father had achieved on my own. I built my own law firm. I had no help from him. And I ended up with the same gold Rolex and a Ferrari and all of these things that I had worked so hard for. Well, that smell of that leather wears off in 30 days. There was no sustainable joy to anything I was doing. And so it felt like the more I got something and the more it wore off, I needed something else. And and I got tired. I was exhausted living a lie. I was exhausted holding up the veneer that people saw me and rooting me for. And so the only thing I knew was to numb this really incredible feeling, this feeling that I was shattered, that I was really inside broken. I told myself that. I would say, "You're broken." And that's a narrative and belief that I fell into. And so I remember
Oh,
when I landed, I went into a neighborhood and I went on an app and I went and I found crystal methamphetamine.
huh.
And I hung out in this room and I was doing meth, and the feeling went away. And I realized at that point that I didn't have this feeling of unworthiness. It it was numbed. And for the first time in a very long time, I found twisted comfort in that. Like,
Huh.
that's where I
Yeah.
found happiness.
Yeah. You could escape that torture of your mind telling you I'm not good enough.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
So you've talked about experiencing dark nights of the soul. What did those, although you just said you got some comfort from those moments, I'm assuming that that's what you're referring to. So correct me if I'm wrong,
Yep.
but what do you feel like you have learned from those rock bottom moments?
Mm, I think the rock bottom moment is the time that I learned the most, not only about myself, but what I needed to find sustainable happiness. And it forced me to confront myself. It forced me to look at what was boiling up inside me. And that's when I realized that it wasn't ego and pride, it was shame. It was the opposite. It was the shame that I felt about what I was now doing to feel better and that I couldn't tell anyone. And shame thrives on that secrecy, the times where we keep things in the dark, and so it thrived. And every night, for a long time, I would leave my office and I'd find these methamphetamine dens, would go in them, and I couldn't tell anyone now. I couldn't tell anyone that I was hurting and I was struggling, and that I felt broken inside, because now what had taken over was shame.
Yeah. Wow. I'm curious because I know you now and you're just one of like the gems on this earth. That moment on the plane or somewhere in there, what did you want the world to see that was Judd?
Mm, me.
What did you, yeah.
I wanted the world to see that I was hurting.
Huh.
I wanted the world to see that I was struggling,
Mhm.
because at home I was enabled by my partner, who supported my use, and no one at work knew. And I was still doing the same, high quality job that I was doing. And so I wanted somebody to see that I was hurting.
Yeah. And if you could answer, I knew that I was more than my external veneer. I was, what would you say? Because I would guess that you would probably say, I was love.
I needed to be human.
You need to be human. And you needed to have that human connection that
Yes.
you are you're an advocate for now.
Yeah. Ultimately, I was pushing away the very thing I was craving, which was connection. And not only with myself, which the drugs pushed me farther and farther from, but from others. And if I didn't know how to show up authentically, if I didn't know how to step out from my shame, if I didn't know how to connect with another human, I had no chance. And I realized that in between being able to do so and not was how vulnerable I was willing to get.
Okay, I want to unpack that a little bit. So, thank you for sharing that story, by the way, because I know it's very vulnerable. So, you've said that you didn't learn emotional regulation until your 40s. What was it like to finally feel in control of your emotions? And how do you show up differently, professionally and personally? I'd love to hear a little bit too, just about your journey to that place. I know you did a lot of inner child work and trauma recovery work. So, dun, 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 dun.
Well, we'll first set into a little bit about childhood. I think Gabor Mate says it best. It's not why the drugs, it's why the pain.
Mm,
And
yeah.
I had to go back before I went forward. And
Uh-huh.
I showed up, I remember, for therapists on my healing journey for EMDR therapy. And the therapist for the first time said, Judd, you're not a drug addict. You have trauma that's unhealed and you're using drugs to numb it. And
Yeah.
so if we can get to the root of the problem, the trauma, then you can start to heal it. And so I had to go back to my childhood where I was abused and abandoned, and really some dark times. I had tried to commit suicide before I was even a teenager. I had gone to a drug rehabilitation in my young 20s, followed by actually institutionalized at a mental hospital where I was Baker acted. And I struggled. I struggled because I didn't know how to handle these big emotions that I was having. And
Yeah.
I never saw anyone in my circle, my family, my community that I grew up in handling their emotions properly. And so I didn't learn how to do it. And then I learned later that actually the emotional regulation, the emotional intelligence that we can show up today is a superpower. It's an absolute superpower. If we're able to take a deep breath and pause for just that microsecond between thinking and acting, and also have an awareness of how we're showing up and how I'm showing up to others and how others may be showing up too. I didn't have any of
Yeah.
these cues. I didn't, I wasn't reading the room for emotions. I was reading the room for the job I had to do, for the success or the objective. And so therefore, when I went to work and I had employees around me, maybe one that was struggling themselves and having a hard time, I paid no attention to it. It didn't matter because what
Mm.
mattered was the job at hand. If you got in the way, get out. And then I realized that when I started to show up with empathy towards others who were struggling, hey, do you need a minute? Maybe you like step outside this meeting. You don't have to come in today. What do you need from
Yeah.
me? How can I support you? And then have an awareness of how I may be showing up. For instance, now I can tell my chief operating officer, hey, Chrissy, I'm having a really bad day today. Can you help me out? And so what happened was learning how to control these emotions really meant one, being able to be aware of how I'm feeling, be vulnerable to be able to express that, and also be aware that others have feelings too. And,
Mm.
I had to enter a world as an adult in survival mode. So everything I did was in survival mode constantly. I became so hyper vigilant that I no longer could eat solid foods. I had to blend my food because my nervous system and my gut was so twisted that I couldn't just put real hard food in my mouth. And so
Yeah.
being in that survival mode, it doesn't enable us to show up with emotional intelligence and emotional regulation. You can't. And so first what I had to do was first get out of survival mode. I had to first be able to calm my nervous system, learn about my nervous system, learn about polyvagal, about fight or flight, about shutdown. There was times where I would basically enable myself to close my eyes and roll my eyes backwards and take myself into Neverland. I didn't know that what I was doing was actually disassociating. So when I went on my journey, I tried everything. What I would encourage anybody on their healing journey is be open to all the different types of things there are for personal development and try them. Some of them work, some of them don't. I didn't like talk therapy, but I loved EMDR.
Yep.
I didn't like sauna stuff and red infrared, but I loved cold therapy and cold plunges. And so,
Yeah.
I tried everything for 2 years. I really went on this transformation to understand why I was showing up the way I was showing up and why I felt that I needed those things that would ultimately lead to happiness. And then once I learned about my own emotional regulation and then connect with that person, my really my inner child, I was able to find out those things that I loved. I found out that I loved yoga. I went last night and it was so great. And I don't know, I'm sitting there just rolling around like, happy baby in the corner and everybody's doing these praying mantis moves. I can't, but it's compassionate and loving. And so,
Yeah.
there Judd is, I'm rolling around in the corner. And so I had to find these things to be able to connect with myself. And then once I was able to know who is Judd and what does Judd need, I can then start showing that up to the world that way.
You started cultivating a real relationship with yourself. I heard this quote not too long ago. It says, refuse to be in a bad relationship with yourself.
I love
And that
that.
really it stopped me in my tracks because we can be so concerned about taking care of, because was there a part in your story, I know you showed up and you wanted the job done and you had this like external veneer, but was there also this people pleasing part of you?
Absolutely. 1,000%. I think one of the parts that helped me with clients so well was that people pleasing was on steroids. And then the other side of that is, the Mr. Nice Guy. And, I played those roles because they're inherently tied to the way I saw myself is the way you saw me. And then when I stopped worrying about how you thought about me and then started thinking about myself in ways that it was like, what does Judd like to eat? What does Judd like to do? And you find this loving thing. And I started this thing and I did it with a friend and it worked great. I called it the 5 for 5 challenge. And here's what I did. My friend Rich and I did it. And for 5 days, we just did these 5 things. That's it. The first one was we would put a Post-it on our note and we took a picture and we'd send it to each other. And the Post-it had to be a love message to yourself.
What? Very on brand with BBP.
Yeah, right. So you had
Love
to give
this.
yourself a love message. The second thing was you had to actually take an action for yourself the same way you would do it for your girlfriend, your partner, your lover, whatever, right? How would you date yourself if you were in that relationship? Because, I know that when I was in relationships, flowers or cards or, emails and love notes and texts and stuff. And so it's like, how can I do that with myself? How can I fall in love with myself?
Yeah.
And the third one was an activity, an hour of activity, walking outside, nature, whatever, exercise, gym. The next thing was you had to learn something. Didn't matter what you learned. How they make a fake plan. I don't know. Whatever. But we shared this. So we wrote our 5 for 5 and we would share it with each other for 5 days.
Love this.
Right? And the last thing was sharing it, was putting it out there for another person to see. And it kept it also accountable. And after 5 days, we liked it so much, we extended it and called it, can we do it for 30 days? Our 30-day challenge. And we kept it up. And Rich talks about it to this day in, some of our conversations later in a way that, wow, what a great way to connect with yourself, really deeply each day and to start to think about yourself in that way. Because what you're really doing is you're modeling the type of person you want to be. In other words, Bridgett, I wasn't empathic in the beginning. I had that I have a little fiddle for you. Like my life was so bad, I have no empathy for you. But then I learned about the power of empathy. And well, what if I want compassion? I need to give compassion. And so what was happening was by telling myself each day for those 5 days, which turned out to a month, Judd, you're good just the way you are. You are lovable. I love you. These kind of messages started to give myself the compassion to develop to myself into a compassionate person. Like I'm not compassionate now, but if I do this, I can become compassionate. It's powerful.
I'm obsessed with that. That's the cutest thing ever.
Yeah.
You need to build that into something.
Yeah, right.
Oh, I love it. A couple things you said there I thought were really interesting, but one was, I think you said a therapist told you that, Judd, you're not a drug addict. You're trying to numb trauma, right? And I think that so many people can relate to that who aren't drug addicts. Like if they're numbing with food, they're numbing with alcohol, they're numbing with anything, shopping. So as a man who's navigated vulnerability and shame, what do you think, speaking to men specifically right now, what do you think is really holding men back from openly discussing their self-image, their self-love, their mental health? And how do you think we can encourage them to start talking about that more openly? I think it's starting to happen, but with people like you, but is there something you think needs to shift?
Yeah, men, we need to shift ourselves. We need to realize that we can become vulnerable with each other. Vulnerability is a strength. It's not a weakness. And, I always like to say bravery starts in the heart. And I think that when a man can be vulnerable with another man, that's when the masculinity starts to shift from toxic to healthy. That's when we're
Ooh.
allowed to express ourselves. You know, we say to men, don't be angry, but be strong. Don't lose your control, but have an aura about you. And so, oftentimes I think men in the world we're growing up in shifts from the boy to manhood without any initiation, without any
Mm.
ability to say, oh, now I become a man. And so without that real deep initiation that happens for women, that doesn't happen for men, we start to look to other men to what manhood looks like. And if we're looking at the wrong role models, we're developing the wrong skill sets to help each other out, to show up for one another, and to be what I believe is, the true modern knight today, which is a man who is able to be vulnerable, who is able to open up, because real trust is built in that way. Men have a bravado about ourselves. There's a story I'll tell you about this. I have a really, really good, wonderful friend, David Mayer, and my ex had introduced us. And when she was telling me about this guy who she was friends with his wife, you're going to love him, she says, except he's a real big New York Giants fan. He loves the Giants. And this was the year they won the Super Bowl, and they were going to do a parade and everything. And I was living in New York City. Well, I'm actually preparing to meet this guy who my ex thinks we're going to be buddy-buddy. And I'm actually reading up about the New York Giants. I don't know anything about them. I didn't even know who the quarterback was. But I knew that I thought that Dave would like me more if I knew about the Giants, if I could, explain that. And, as it turns out, I like reading the news, and all the front side of the newspaper. And so when David and I met, actually the first time we met, I was quite inauthentic, because I'm like, hey, did you see the game with San Francisco? What a game. And it's like, I read about it.
And you hadn't even watched the game.
I hadn't even watched the game. And like, here I am trying to develop this relationship with this other guy, thinking that if I come with this angle, we're gonna bond better. And as it turned out, like a couple weeks in, as we're starting to talk and we are starting to kind of like have our own guy moments, right? Talking about our wives and talking about life is whatever. That's when our relationship really blossomed. That's like when it really grew. And it wasn't in the shallow, the sport talk moments. It was actually in the moments where we're like, we have 3 kids the same ages at that time. And, we were able to say like, I don't know, I'm barely holding it together. How you doing? Yeah, me too. We got like 10%. Okay. And now we happen to be best friends because he likes the back of the newspaper in the New York Post with the sports, and I like the front. Not because we like the same.
Yeah.
But,
I love that.
And so that, to me, that's what more men need. My relationship with David Mayer would never have been the same had I stayed as this person that I wanted him to see, as opposed to just really being me.
In your intro, I told everybody that you have 6 children. And so Judd, his 6th child, Judd just had, he has a newborn, which I know, so your kids are a little bit older. So you're you feel like you're having this like second chance at fatherhood a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
What would you want to teach him when it comes to masculinity? I know he's just a little baby, but if you could just like think of him as a young adult.
When my first 2 or 3 were born, I think the next day I went to work, maybe including the 3rd, because that's what I thought I needed to do. That's what I saw in my father. My job is a provider. I have no other purpose. That's my job. And so I went and I did my job. And then I thought that I was being a good father and a good man. And I was there from, morning to night, missing out on all the the moments, the tiny, precious moments. And then when other men in my office, other attorneys would have children of their own, I never thought about giving paternity leave. I didn't give any dad a day off. I led like I lived. And I think oftentimes we all lead like we live because that's the narrative or the lens that we see things through. And so I never had the moment to think to give other dads a day with their newborns.
Yeah.
And the reason is because I didn't realize that I had an emotional component. I didn't realize that all the time that aside from breastfeeding, there's a lot that I can offer. And and now, as you pointed out, it's this opportunity, this blessing to relive these moments. And now I stayed home. I took maternity leave for the first 6 weeks. He's now just under 8 weeks. And, for the first 6 weeks, I stayed home and was there, like in it. And I realized how difficult it is. I realized how exhausting and tiring it can be. And I realized
Yeah.
how much more moms need support and moms need help
Yes.
and dads have something to offer. And so I want my son to grow up knowing that there's so much more than just providing, that his emotions matter, that his emotions mean something to him and to other people, that there is an incredible emotional value to his humanity. And I believe then he can also help other boys and men too, because then we start to develop a shift in our society where guys start to look at each other in a different way.
Yeah. Oh, thank God for guys like you. We need you
Mm,
guys. We really, really, really do right
mm.
now, too. So, authenticity is so central to your message. So, I want to dive into that a little bit. But the reality is, we live in this world that's, obsessed with achievement and people are left feeling empty inside. If you could just say a couple things you wish more people understood about true success, what would you tell them?
It's found in sustainable happiness.
And how do you find sustainable happiness?
It's a great question. For me, I found it in service to others. That the
Mm,
joy that I was looking for was not in the fine leather trim of a Ferrari, in the big oversized rims of an SUV. It was found when I'm in service of others, when I'm helping others, doing for others. And so I think there's a core element of that in most of recovery programs, right? A lot of times that's in sponsorship and mentoring and they say, helping another addict. And I think that
yeah.
I found that in life itself. I remember when I was leaving rehab, they let you go out with a poem or a quote, and they have a song for you. And for me, they read The Man in the Arena. We go into the arena and get dusty and marred and bloodied. And the idea behind it is that's where life takes place. And it takes
Mm,
bravery and courage to go in there. And it's easy for the people in the cheap seats, right, to be judging and shaming and calling out your failures. I think the success is found in every time we walk out of that arena, all bruised up and scarred and bloodied. And that's where the needle moves. That's where we really start what really moves us. Because what
mhm.
happened was all of those things, right, they wear off very quickly. Material things don't last very long. But the moment of going, I would when I was living out in California, I would travel out to all of the homeless camps. Would bring chips and things of that nature. So much so that I contacted the Newport Police Department and told them that I was going around and I'm looking for more homeless people to go help. And
Oh,
and that's because at therapy, when I went out after they read The Man in the Arena, the therapist said, Judd, if you want to find that sustainable happiness, go help another person. And so that's what I did. And the police officer said, yeah, you know what? If you go to the Newport bus station, usually at night because it's well lit, you'll find a lot of homeless people. And so now you can imagine, here I am. And they shared with me that what they actually need is the women need feminine products and men, need underwear and socks. And so I went to Target or Walmart and I bought, the packs of socks and underwear, and I bought boxes of tampons and some other feminine products. And I
Mhm.
loaded the my Ferrari and I drove my Ferrari to this Newport bus station in the like 11 o'clock at night. I'm the only car there. There's no buses, and there's a bunch of, homeless laid out in different areas. And I went around to them, and one woman, I realized I shouldn't walk too close to her. She's not mentally there. And so I left them just on the side. I saw another group smoking some kind of drugs. I knew that wasn't great for me. So I didn't go too far over. I just told them, hey guys, I have some socks and some underwear. I'm going to leave over here if you want. Some others I walked up to, and I started doing this, and then I came back, and boy, when I looked at my car as I was walking back to it, that's when I realized it wasn't what was in front of me. It was what was right behind me that made me feel
Hmm.
that joy. And so I got in my
Yeah.
car and I drove back. And the next day I started to go to the Newport Pier that night, and the Balboa Pier. And for weeks, I would go from pier to pier and same products. And I put them in my cart. And I had a electric bike now. And I would ride the bike to these piers and I would hand them out. And I went by JB. I would introduce myself as JB, which are my first initial, my middle initial. And one day, Bridgett, when I went to the Balboa Pier, there was a tent. And oftentimes I would introduce myself. Hi, I'm JB. I'm just handing out some stuff, around. I have some socks here, some chips or things like that. Is there anything you want? And sometimes they would say, leave it outside, or other times they would engage and I'd have a conversation. This particular time, I introduced myself and the guy opens his tent. He says, what did you say your name was? I said, JB. He said, I heard about you. He said, I heard about you from the other pier that you've been handing things out. And I was like, yeah, that's me. He's like, that's cool, JB. I appreciate it. And he put his hand out to shake my hand. And I shook his hand. And Bridgett, I mean, that moment, I found sustainable joy. I was now known for the right reasons.
So bravery starts in the heart. Explain that motto to us a little bit more. You mentioned it a few times.
I was having this great conversation the other day about what bravery is. And, at my law firm, I think bravery is fighting for injustice, right? Fighting against it, fighting for justice, fighting for the injured against the big insurance giants. And that takes bravery. And then it led to I started to develop a children's picture book series called Sterling in the Night. And there it is. There it is. There's Sterling and
Oh, I
Pip,
got
Nugget the
them. I got
Dragon.
them here. We're going to
Um,
talk about these.
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
There's
how cute are
Max
these? Oh,
Mayer and Jada. I was writing these books and I realized that what I was really doing was writing about this inner child of mine of how I wanted him to show up, how I would have liked to show up as a child. And through those adventures, but I realized that what he was doing was he was coming up from a place of love and compassion and care. And so I thought that each time Sterling made these adventures, in the first book, he went to go help a dragon that's hurt. In the second book, he goes to help a girl who's not being treated fairly. And in the third book, he goes and actually tries to find a connection. And in each of those adventures, I realized that what Sterling was doing was he was coming from a place from his heart. That bravery, the place Sterling was showing up with courage, came nothing more than from the heart. And
yeah.
so I started to say that bravery starts in the heart. And now, for organizations, I even say leadership starts in the heart. It means coming from a place of showing up as you are, regardless of how others may think, to go against the trend when you know it's the right thing to do.
Yes.
And I
love
think
that.
the most bravest thing that any child or young person can do is to tell another person how they're feeling,
Why?
because it's the only way we can really get connection and help. When we're able to say,
Absolutely.
I'm really having a hard day, or I'm really feeling sad right now, or I'm feeling anger and I don't know how to get it out of my body. When we can teach our children to communicate because they speak with emotions. A 4-year-old can't say they have anxiety, but they're like, Mommy, my tummy is really hurting me.
Yeah.
And so if we
Or they're
can
having a breakdown or tantrum. Yep.
totally, if we can help our children communicate by understanding their emotions and being able to verbalize that, that's a real courageous and powerful thing to do. That's setting skills to allow our children to grow up as healthy adults. Learning those skill sets. And so I feel that that takes bravery for a kid to walk over to another kid sitting alone at the lunch table and saying, Hey, I see nobody else is sitting here. Do you want somebody to sit with? Can I sit with you?
Yeah.
Wow, it takes bravery. But imagine the shift, what happens not only in the person who's giving that love, but for the other person who we may never know is actually hurting more than ever.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting that it takes so much bravery just to be authentic in today's
Mm,
world. I think it's also really beautiful that so many of us are advocating and really showing up as authentic as we can. It's a process still little by little, but it just shows me that we have a lot of work to do still, to be honest.
totally, totally. And you know
Mhm.
what, Bridget? I think so many of us are wearing masks so long that we don't even know we're wearing them anymore.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
or we're just so deeply ingrained in the narrative and belief that we bought into, we just refuse to take it off.
Yeah. Or
And
to see a different way. I always say, like, can you be curious? Can you just be curious?
tell me more about that.
Sometimes we live with sort of our mask and like our blinders on. And if you could just open your world up to curiosity, to just be able to see a different way, or to be able to really question, like, how am I feeling? Why do I feel this way? Just be curious about everything. I think it starts to unravel some of those masks that are like ironed in there. But I think it takes curiosity.
Hmm. At Beyond Beauty Project, the organization, you guys are really doing such important work. And I'm curious, let's start with maybe other women, right? The other women are showing up that they're putting on an appearance, or they're constantly worried about their weight, or how their hair is done or something like that. And they have children, right?
Hmm.
So one of the things that I'm starting to see is that us parents or adults aren't realizing that what we're doing is modeling behavior that we may not want
Yes.
our children to mirror. And
Hmm.
the other part is that we're holding ourselves back from probably truly thriving and even making even deeper connections. And so when you have clients or when you're seeing people, how do you help them? What's the first step to taking that mask off?
I basically grew up in the modeling industry. So a lot
Yeah.
of my girlfriends around me, or they're actresses, so there's a lot of people in my close circle that are very concerned about their appearance, I would say. But I'll just kind of like sprinkle a little thought in their mind. They really don't realize it, but I think the more awareness and the more education that I can kind of like get in there, even like slowly,
Mhm.
it helps them start to see. I was even with a girlfriend just recently for a weekend, and I was talking about filtering. It was the clip from your podcast. And I
Mm.
said, did you see my clip about filters? Because she filters everything. She's like, I've seen one. I've seen one of those that you've done. And I'm like, no, watch this one. I made her watch it. And she's like, do I do that? I was like, maybe. Like, just think about it, because your children are watching. Like, no shame, but I think it's the education and awareness that we have to start with. And then being curious, if you can I always say to them too, look at how much time is being spent on the outside. Really look at your day, look at your week. How much time is it taking up? Are you constantly getting babysitters because you need to go to the cosmetic dermatologist or do this? Is it taking up most of your day? You're missing out on life. You're living on the sidelines of your life, objectifying your life when you do that constantly. So can you shift it? Can you get curious just about shifting it a little bit? Okay. Your cure framework. I want you to just talk about that a little bit. I know it really focuses on building these real human connections, which I know that you believe is important for our life and leadership. So explain a little bit about that.
The frameworks came out of reverse engineering my own healing. The first one is the connection cure. And the connection cure framework, CURE, CURE, stands for connection, understanding, renew, and expand. What it means is, in order to thrive, I believe, in my experience, the first thing you need to do is have conscious awareness to how you're showing up in the world. So the first one is, in order to get that connection, you need to know how you're showing up. And there are a lot of reasons for the way we're showing up. And so that's where understanding comes in. Why are you doing that? For instance, for me, I knew that it was the childhood trauma and early mirroring that led me to seek such external validation. And once I understood that, I could start to heal it. And then you go into the R, which is renew. First, renewing the connection with yourself, the 5 for 5 challenge, or do it for 30 days, and really, really having a deep relationship with yourself. And then being able to renew other connections, showing up that way. And then lastly, expanding. To your point, how can we teach other people the importance of connection? How can we create new connections? And the connection cure framework was established in order to help individuals who I feel are stuck, who are just where I was, just cannot get a grip on some sustainable joy. They've done everything they can, and the happiness, the deep happiness, isn't there. The connection cure is for them. And then what happened was, I reversed engineered the same healing that had taken place at my workplace. When I was able to show up to Chrissy and tell Chrissy, hey, I'm having a hard time, and not pretend that everything's okay, that's when Chrissy actually and I started our deeper connection. Because then we started real build truth, trust, honesty, openness. So I started to do that in my workplace. And where I found was the problem in the workplace was that this whole time when I'm showing up, hiding my own mistakes and insecurities, I'm indirectly telling my team that they have to hide theirs too. And so what I had to do was I had to strip the shame from the workplace. I had to get it out. I had to do that so that my team felt comfortable to raise their hand and to say, hey, I don't have all the answers. I need some collaboration, because we can't manage mistakes. You can't manage those mistakes, particularly when they're kept secret. And so in order to flush all of this to the surface, we developed the workplace cure. The workplace cure is connection, understanding vulnerability, respect, and empowerment. And there in the workplace itself means, first, you have to establish connection. In order to create connection that thrives, you have to lead with connection. And then once we understand the power of vulnerability, again, that it's not a weakness, that it's a strength. And the more vulnerable we are with our team, hey, I'm stuck here. I'm spinning my wheels. I can't get anywhere. The more we start to create creativity and results.
Yeah, innovation.
Totally.
Well, you let them, it sounds like you let your team, and you're helping other teams learn how to be human, to show up, like say, I'm going to exist as a real human that has emotions and gets stuck sometimes.
This is an absolute template to allow your team to show up for the reasons they were hired.
I have one last question for you.
Sure.
Do you still have your Ferrari?
I don't.
Did you get rid of it? Why would you do that?
You know,
that's remember when I first met you and you're like, I got rid of the yacht, and I'm like, why would you do that? We're friends now.
Right? It's nice to have a boat, but it's better to have a friend with a boat. So now I'm looking for the friend with a boat rather than a boat.
Let's find the friend with the boat. Okay, tell everybody where they can connect with you and a little bit about what you're offering right now, because you're doing some great things. So I want everyone to know.
Thank you. We have a hub now. We call it like the Juddverse, because there's a lot of things that are going on between keynote speaking and coaching and workshops, lawyering, the kids book. And so if you go to juddshaw.com, that's where you'll find sort of the gateway and the map to finding all of the other things that are happening. Also, you can go to Sterling the Night and follow us on social at Judd Shaw Official. We try to put out things that are really for our audience. I mean, you won't find it. Here's what I did today. It's really about what we're doing in this ecosystem, and then putting it out there for others to be able to learn and develop.
Mm-hmm. You're giving back.
Finding joy.
I love that. You're finding your joy. I love that. Thank you so much. We'll share everything that with you guys that he just said. Thank you so much for being here. I love chatting with you. Sorry we talked so long, everybody, but it is what it is.
Bridgett, you are amazing, and the work at Beyond Beauty Project is really important. And I'm just continued glad to be a part of it.
Thank you. I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Thank you for listening or watching Beyond Beauty Project, the podcast. If today resonated with you, pass it on to a friend. And to keep the conversation going, check out the workshops that I facilitate. For preteens to adults, we challenge perfectionism, we redefine confidence, and we really get back in tune with our minds and our bodies. I also offer keynotes for colleges and corporate, where I provide thought-provoking talks about redefining success and getting back in tune with your true self and your true genius. Subscribe to our newsletter, where you can keep up to date on everything BBP related. And as always, we love to hear from you. So drop us a review, send us a DM, and I will see you next week.